Chapter 1, Grandfather's Quest. As I see it, Grandfather had just 3 missions in his life. His first mission was to try to learn, preserve, and pass down as many of the old skills of survival, tracking, and awareness as possible, and do so by living with the earth with as little as he could. It was not just the practical and physical skills of his people that were important to him, but of all the peoples that live close to the earth. He sought out anyone with any primitive skill, no matter if it came from the Native American culture or for some old hermit living in the bush. Everything interested him, and he wanted to learn everything and anything. His quest to try to find and learn these skills took him from Alaska to South America, from the East Coast to the West Coast of America, and everywhere in between. He wanted to learn skills that could be used in any environment, any weather condition, and in any topography. Most of all, he wanted to know what skills would become universal to all places and situations. So, too, he would learn the skills known both by men and by women. Grandfather could see that these ancient skills were being lost to modern man. To him, these skills were the doorway back to the earth and to the ultimate freedom from society's strangling grip. They were a way to fulfill one's purpose for being born to the earth, to make things better for future generations by caretaking creation. The survival skills were a tool that would end the struggle between man and nature, where there was no longer any clash, only a perfect balance and harmony. It is through these ancient skills that man can make a home in wilderness, a real Garden of Eden where all struggle was finally ended. So the preservation and use of these skills became his first quest, a quest that would not end until the day he took his final walk. His second quest in life was to preserve the ancient spiritual wisdom not only of his people, but anyone who lived close to the earth. He did not seek the things that did not work or worked only for a few, but he sought a truth that produced miraculous results. He was determined to find, preserve, and pass down spiritual wisdom that was viable and would work all of the time. He sought a dynamic communication with the world of nature and the realm of spirit that would work for anyone and everyone. He knew that living in nature on a physical level was but a small part of the whole consciousness of wilderness. Man had to go deeper than just the flesh, otherwise man's existence in the world of nature would still contain a deep separation. Without spiritual skills, man could not become one with the natural world nor communicate with the things beyond his own flesh. His final quest was to learn all that he could from every philosophy and religion. He sought a common truth, free from the crutches of man. He searched through all the customs, the ceremonies, the dogmas, and the traditions of religion and philosophy, stripped away all the confusing camouflage, and arrived at a pure truth. It was the search for these spiritual truths and spiritual knowledge that was the main driving force in his life. In all that he pursued, the spiritual was the foremost on his mind. Even when he taught Rick and me, most of what he had passed down was that of the spiritual. Even the practical skills had deeper spiritual meaning, so that there was rarely a time or a lesson that did not encompass his spiritual teachings. Grandfather's quest, his search for the truth, led him far from his people and from a life that would be considered normal by any standards. He abandoned his people and laid down his life for his quest. For 63 years of his life he wandered and searched, many times living on the edge of life and death. So too did he face many hardships that would have driven most men from their paths. He pushed himself hard, never being satisfied with just a superficial understanding, but instead seeking the deeper and more profound meanings of skill and spirit. He drove himself harder than anyone I have ever encountered in my life, and I longed to be able to have the resolve and dedication that he had. Nothing distracted him from that path, not even the hopelessness of his overall vision. The vision to try to save the earth by teaching the truth. Even when no one would listen, he would not give up, for there was always hope, and he had to live his vision or not live at all. It was within the first few months of our meeting that Grandfather told us what had driven him to this quest. We had been curious as to what had led him to this path, and it was only after a lot of coaxing and prodding that he revealed to us his story. It was the story of the white coyote and the spirit warrior that would forever change his path. That one night, sitting by a small campfire deep in the heart of the Pine Barrens, Grandfather revealed to us the vision that drove him to his path, the reason that he faced so much hardship and endless lonely searching, a quest that he had to undertake without question. Grandfather began his life as a small child did, learning the ways of gathering herbs, cooking, mending, and making camp, as well as learning the philosophy and mythology behind each activity and skill. All things of the camp were of the domain of the women of the tribe, and it was in these matters that Grandfather was first schooled. These teachings were never thought of as being lesser, but rather as necessary life skills for the hunter and the scout. To his people, within their vision of the completeness of life, innate power or spiritual growth exists regardless of gender. All skills were necessary to keep the camp alive. So Grandfather was taught all the things of the camp. From the women, he learned the compassion of healing, the mothering instinct, and the profound patience that would serve him throughout his life. The women of his people were always highly respected for their power and medicine. It was the women who gave him his first spiritual tutoring, which was the catalyst that started him on his spiritual path. Grandfather was the youngest member of all the small group of displaced Apaches, and as such was somewhat of a child to all. But his great-grandfather, called Coyote Thunder, was his foremost guardian and his most powerful teacher. Even while Grandfather was under the tutelage of the women of the tribe, Coyote Thunder still oversaw his education. By tradition, Grandfather was, at age 7, officially given over to the care and teaching of Coyote Thunder and the other tribesmen in order to learn the ways of the men. Now he began to learn the skills of the hunt. He learned to make bows, lances, clubs, arrowheads, and traps. As with the lessons of the camp, each lesson of the hunt, each new tool, each new skill was accompanied by a story explaining the underlying spiritual implications and mythologies. Later, he learned to trap and track. He learned the honor of the hunt and the dignity of the stalk. It was from his prowess as a stalker that Grandfather acquired the name Stalking Wolf. One day, some of the elders watched him stalk and then touch a wolf, one of the most aware, cunning, and hence most difficult animals to catch. Thus, in ceremony, Grandfather was renamed. Stalking Wolf became one of the greatest hunters of the group, always providing meat as well as medicinal herbs. Always, when returning from the hunt, he would first feed the sick and the weak, or bring them the medicinal herbs he had collected from his hunting trip. By the time he reached 10 winters, he was leading his own hunting parties. But Grandfather preferred to hunt alone, and it was on such a hunt that he was given a vision, a powerful vision that would change his life and direct him toward a path of medicine. certainly before he had undertaken ritual quests of the Spirit, and with each quest he had gained insight and understanding. But the grand visions of life came infrequently, and then only after long searching and many vision quests. This, however, was the first vision quest to address the questions of his path and purpose in life, a guiding force that would prepare the ground for future visions and quests. He was hunting alone, far from his people. This hunt was for the mountain lion, an animal whose stealth awareness almost always required the hunter to be alone. He had been fasting for the entire hunt, 4 days in all, and he had traveled without rest to the place where his father once killed a white mountain lion, the skin of which grandfather still used for his medicine bundle. Upon reaching his destination, he climbed to a high ridge to sit and to pray. A spirit in the guise of an ancient warrior and scout appeared before him. The spirit just stood there, looking at him. It was a searching look, searing through his flesh, looking straight through to grandfather's heart and spirit. When grandfather tried to communicate with the spirit using both language and sign, he was ignored. And so, for a long time, they each stared at each other. Grandfather said that he was at once both fascinated and fearful. Instinctively, however, he knew that the Ancient One was a messenger from the bright vision, not from darkness. The spirit then approached grandfather. In his right hand he held the ancient headband of the Scout Society, and in his left hand he held the feathered staff of a shaman. Without word or ceremony, he first handed grandfather the scout headband, paused, then handed him the staff. Grandfather trembled inwardly with fear and excitement, unable to think or to move. The spirit backed away and resumed his silent vigil, gazing at grandfather as he held the gifts in his outstretched hands. Slowly, feeling the powerful force of the medicine items he held, grandfather drew them in and clutched them to his chest. His motion was the symbol of accepted gift and spiritual possession. At this sign of acceptance, the Ancient One smiled, nodded slightly, then made the sign for 10 winters, 10 years, and faded from view. In his place stood a huge white mountain lion. It growled at the sky, turned, and then slipped from white to gray, and then to shadow. Grandfather was shaken with what he had experienced. The objects he held were very old and tattered, but they were very real and extraordinarily beautiful. He was aware of the awesome power, the mystery they contained, and the honor of holding them. They were fascinating, compelling, as if containing the knowledge of the ages. He sat until dark, rethinking what he had witnessed, and the mystery of all that had happened overwhelmed him. He had so many questions, and the answers that came were vague at best. He arose from this place and walked down to the creek to wash. From the mists of dusk, the spirit reappeared, this time accompanied by the white mountain lion walking by his side. From across the creek, the spirit again stood facing him, watching. Again, after a long, oppressive silence, he made the sign for 60 winters and gestured toward grandfather. The mountain lion arose and leapt across the creek to grandfather. With an uttered sound, the lion passed to grandfather the ancient medicine of the traveler, while across the riverbank the Ancient One pointed the directions. Motioning to the east, the spirit and the lion faded into the shadows. Grandfather looked toward the eastern horizon where the spirit had last pointed, and there, in a cluster of pines, stood a young white coyote, but it too faded from view, vanishing into the moonlight. Grandfather was even more shaken. Greater questions fell around him. try as he might, nothing seemed to make any sense. Grandfather stayed in this sacred place for 4 more days, waiting for explanations, searching for answers. Perhaps there would be yet another vision, one that would dispel his confusion. When earth and spirit refused to speak, however, he headed back to the tribe and to the wisdom of the elders. The ancient tradition was to seek out the guidance of the elders and tribal shaman, especially where a vision was concerned. The elders had always helped before on all of his quests and spiritual searchings, but he'd wondered if they could really help him now. He didn't even know if he should reveal any of what he had seen, or for that matter, show them the sacred staff and headband. Did his reluctance to share these matters stem simply from a feeling of possessiveness, or could it possibly be that in the sharing he would be violating some sacred trust between himself and the spirit of the scout? He took his time with the journey back to the encampment so that he would have plenty of time to search his heart for answers. By the time camp came into view, he knew what he would have to do, and that was to ask the elders for help. He had searched his heart for this answer, and it felt good. His heart was, he knew, the only thing he could trust for clear thinking. And so he asked the elders to give him a council fire, following the old tradition of presenting them all with gifts for their time, effort, and wisdom. That night, in a simple ceremony, Grandfather danced his vision, describing in detail its events and symbols. He displayed the sacred items, but sensing the sacredness and power within, none would touch or disturb them. Once the vision story was complete, the elders asked Grandfather a few questions for clarity, then sent him away. It was customary to leave the elders in silence once the vision was told. This would give the elders time to discuss the vision, and the seeker time to meditate. It would also allow the elders time to prepare for any ceremony or ordeal that they felt the seeker should witness. 4 days later, Grandfather was called from the hills, his personal place of solitude and prayer, to sit before the elders once again. They met him in a big brushy lodge at the far end of camp. The mood was somber and reverent. They sat in a semicircle before a small fire, and the smoke of many sacred herbs hung heavy in the rafters. Opposite the semicircle, Grandfather sat alone before the fire, awaiting patiently the reply of the elders. Coyote Thunder spoke first, his voice weak with age, trembling with sadness. Yet the gleam in his eye held hope and pride. He told Grandfather that the vision and the Spirit had guided him toward a path he must take. To follow his vision, he must first spend 10 winters training to become a scout, one of the most powerful positions in the tribe. He must then abandon this path for another 10 winters and seek the path of the shaman and healer. And finally, Coyote told him, he would have to leave his people and wander alone for 60 more winters, seeking vision and knowledge until his vision was reality. Grandfather's spirit soared at the thought of becoming a scout, and he felt greatly honored that he had been chosen for the path of the shaman. But his heart was sad at the prospect of having to leave his people and his homeland for so long a time. He asked Coyote if there was a way he could stay and still fulfill his vision, a way in which all could share with him his honor, and he could honor his people. Coyote was adamant in his refusal. A man not living his vision is living death. Unless there is a question that the vision was a trick of the mind, the vision should never be altered. But the sacred items I hold are real, and so the vision is real. Coyote went on to explain that Grandfather's calling was from the Creator, and its undertaking was necessary for the overall vision of his people and for the earth. that although Coyote's heart would be sick and sad at Grandfather's eventual departure, the journey was essential, even critical. Coyote ended by saying, "You have been my hope for many years, my life, but at the end of the training, for the good of all things you must go." The other elders, men and women, echoed the feelings of Coyote and encouraged Grandfather in his quest. There was no communal ceremony or feast at the finish of this council, for Grandfather had chosen the life of a scout, a path that would, throughout his training, separate him from the group. With this exile, he would begin his journey. He would now sleep alone, eat alone, and live alone. Grandfather then journeyed frequently, for weeks at a stretch and without any man-made tools, into the harshest lands. He honed his survival skills until they became instinctual. He came to look upon even the most violent and lonely of places as home, and found comfort and security where other men would only find death. He became an animal again, a shadow living on pure sunshine and air, survival and the ability to face any environment without the need of any supplies were skills essential to the scout. Thus, the many skills of survival and the philosophy behind them became Grandfather's first priority. It was only through survival that a scout learned to become one with the landscape, to find refuge in the most rugged terrains. Survival practice took Grandfather far from his people for great periods of time and introduced him to many landscapes and environments. He learned how to survive easily in the hottest of deserts, on the mesas, on the plains, in the coldest snows, and in the depths of the deepest forests. Each survival test the elders put him through he easily passed, oftentimes to the disbelief of the old ones. Where he should have been emaciated with starvation and exposure, he seemed to flourish. He could live where no one else could. He could travel at great speeds and over great distances where even the animals faltered. His skill was unparalleled by any tribal member, and even the noted elders marveled at his ability. Once the survival skills were mastered, he was then led to the art of tracking, stalking, and awareness. Absolute proficiencies in these skills, the ability to move silent and unseen across landscapes with little cover, the ability to observe all things at a glance were essential to a scout. Tracking, stalking, and awareness are never separated, but rather viewed as a whole, a sort of continuum in which one is dependent on the others for absolute precision and perfection. These skills, coupled with the ability to survive, made of the scout a shadowy ghost, mystical and shrouded in an air of secrecy and legend, much like the ancient ninjas. Grandfather's lessons and ordeal were soon intensified in these areas. The tests of the elders pushed Grandfather to the limits of his ability and beyond. Grandfather worked long and hard, pushing himself harder than the elders pushed him, always holding his vision as a driving force, always trying to live up to and beyond the expectations of the elders. He stalked without ceasing, slipping unobserved in and out of camp. He tracked, stalked, and ultimately touched all manner of animals, moving as if composed more of spirit than of flesh. He added danger to his tests by stalking powerful animals where one mistake could cost him his life. Finally, he stalked and tracked the camps of others, hostile tribes, cavalry, and settlers. He pushed his skill to the limits of mortal man, traveling alone, open ground, never observed in form or in track by his enemies. Truly, he lived up to his name as the one who stalks wolves. It was the awareness lessons and tests, however, that were of paramount importance. For Grandfather, for the scout, awareness of all things close and afar were essential both to his own personal survival and to the survival of his people. It was the scout's awareness that kept his people safe. So Stalking Wolf pushed himself to observe at all levels, not only on the physical level, but also on a deeper, more encompassing spiritual level. Eventually his skills transcended the mere senses, and he began to reach beyond to the force of life itself. The confluence of physical sensing and spiritual awareness was eventually so complete that he could tell when something was moving far off in the distance beyond the limitations of his physical senses, but he was often at a loss to explain how and why. Complete awareness became for him a state of being. It was said of him that if a feather dropped from a bird several miles away, Grandfather would know about it. This keen level of awareness that Grandfather developed began to break down the distinction between the inner and outer dimension, creating a oneness of self where nothing happened that he could not feel. Then came the training that Grandfather hated, but had to learn: the kill. The mark of a good scout was the ability to become invisible, to be able to get in and get out of situations without being detected, but sometimes his life depended on his fighting ability. Grandfather abhorred warfare and the pain and slaughter that went with it, but he learned its skills just as well as he had those of absolute survival, tracking, stalking, and observation. He understood the necessity of the fight, but his heart would never agree with his ability, nor could he find any honor in it. And so, during the tests of the fight and the kill, he would never hurt an enemy, only take their weapons, tie them up, or mark part of the flesh in red to show how the kill would have taken place. Only a few times did he have to fight, but these fights ended quickly because of his agility and the strength acquired from his powerful lifestyle. Sometimes Grandfather would lead bands of warriors to distant lands to check on neighbors to ensure the security of the tribe. Only once did he actually have to fight, and that was when he rescued a young Lipan woman from her captors. He left them alive, however, unharmed and ashamed. He became a powerful force among his people, an excellent scout. And though he was very young, he was considered by many to be an elder, or grandfather, meaning teacher. To nearby tribes and the cavalry, his prowess assumed mythic proportions. He was so feared by many that even a fleeting appearance of him at the edge of camp would send warriors into a blind panic. To neighboring tribes, every time something went wrong or was missing, the people would smile and blame it on Grandfather. When someone was walking alone and felt he was being watched, the common expression was that the wolf was doing the watching, or he was wolf-watched, as it was sometimes called. As Grandfather's skill as a scout neared perfection, the elders held a council with him again. It was just past 5 winters from the first major meeting, and they met as they had before in the big lodge at the edge of the old village. Again he faced the elders, but this time the ambience of the lodge and the mood of the old ones was different. The lodge itself had remained the same, the fire at its center was low, and the smoky scents of sacred herbs hung in the air. Now, however, the lodge was filled with a myriad of sacred items of the tribe, and the elders wore their most sacred attire. The attitude was one of reverent worship. A lone drum rang out softly from the dark recesses of the outer lodge poles, and there was a presence beyond that of the elders. It was a powerful feeling, a feeling that the spirit world stood with rapt attention, watching, waiting, guiding the words that the elders would speak. The old ones seemed to be listening beyond the mortal sounds of the night to voices that only the pure of heart could hear. Grandfather stayed in the lodge for 6 days of teaching from the elders. They all fasted. They all prayed. Sleep was rare. When one elder counseled Grandfather, the others would sleep. Grandfather's mind and emotion, body and spirit swooned with fatigue and the intensity of it all, but he held on. He knew that this was his initiation to an apprenticeship in the shamanic way of life. This had to be his vision. This was his driving force, and he wanted to live this vision or not live at all. The lessons imparted during this session in the lodge formed the essentials of a code of ethics by which the healer and the shaman lived, a direction and a path to greater spiritual power. Chant, song, and ceremony followed each of the major lessons. At these times, the lodge would come alive with sound and motion, freeing Grandfather's spirits from the talons of fatigue. At the end of the 6th day, Grandfather was sent away for his first test. He would wander the deserts for 2 moons. At the end of this time, he would return to the elders, if he was still alive, for further counsel. The desert felt like a furnace. His task was to face this emptiness purely, to live without tools, fire, or clothing. He could not trap, hunt, or kill. Instead, he would have to forage the leaves of plants as did the deer, and lick the dew from the rocks and sand as did the mice. No shelter could he build, for he had to wander to the limits of starvation, thirst, and fatigue. He was not permitted to speak or communicate in any way with any being, not even with the Creator. To all, he no longer existed. He had to walk as the dead. It was his first trial, a trial of one long, walking, waking vision quest to show himself and the Creator that he was worthy of the path of the shaman, to show all of creation that he wished to walk this path more than he wished to live, and that everything he owned, even himself, was sacrificed and dedicated to this path, this vision of visions. In retrospect, Grandfather remembered only the first 4 days and the last 7. All else remained vague and dreamlike. Of the first 4 days, he remembered vividly the fatigue, the thirst, the starkness of the landscape, and the intense heat of the sun, which seemingly burned holes into his soul. No one, nothing spoke to him, nothing yielded any sign or concern. Except for the perpetual pain and fear, he felt as if he had ceased to exist. On the 4th day, he remembered falling from a high ledge of rock. His body pounded into the sand below as if slammed onto a hot anvil. Then all reality was gone. Surreal images rushed to fill the void. Events and teachings, symbols and signs ran by him at high speed, flooding his mind with a swirling mass of unconnected knowledge. He remembered long and short journeys of the imagination. He saw and spoke with spirit entities of animal, plant, rock, wind, and water. He heard the voice of many spirit things. He remembered knowing all things, and then nothing. He awoke many miles from where he remembered falling from the ledge. He noticed the autumn colors and realized that the seasons had changed, that he was several weeks beyond the time of his fall. Yet his body was undamaged. He felt no fatigue, hunger, pain, or thirst. His once parched and broken skin was as soft and resilient as the day he had first seen the world. But he could not piece together the past weeks of forgotten travel, or of lessons he knew he must have learned along the way. And he realized that the hell of the barren desert could no longer affect him. He had been reborn, renewed, and had moved beyond the effects of comfort and pain. He now traveled easily, without restrictions of the flesh. His senses reached beyond human limitations. He knew instinctively things of life and of creation that he had never consciously, willfully learned. And he understood that with the fusion of inner and outer dimension came a release from the physical skills of survival. There was only then the balance, the harmony of his thought and spirit with that of the universal mind force. He had arrived at that sacred oneness. On the morning of the appointed day, he returned to the camp. The elders were amazed, for Grandfather's life force seemed to glow from deep within him. Here he stood, fresh, relaxed, and powerful, unscarred from his ordeal. It was as if the Creator had taken his life only to send it back more alive than he had ever been, full of knowledge and power. From that day on, for the next 5 winters, he was schooled by the elders, and he flourished. His lessons were learned quickly and effectively, and his tests and trials were undertaken with ease. His knowledge of the old ways grew daily, but as months passed, Grandfather came to see that the old ones could teach him no more, that all they could offer was a physical reinforcement of what he had learned intuitively on his first quest in the desert. The desert quest had certainly been mysterious, shocking sometimes, yet he never questioned the truth of the spirit world or of the Creator. He knew that all things were possible. He did not need to know why. All he needed was absolute faith. Nearing the end of his training, the elders began to address him as Grandfather, though he was still in his early 20s. At first, Coyote Thunder called him brother, but it wasn't long before he, as the others, called him Grandfather. He was given all the honors of an elder, and he traveled frequently into the wilderness to quest and pray, or to heal a distant patient. The group quickly learned to depend on Grandfather's wisdom and power for guidance. It was when he returned from a long trip one day that he discovered his people gone. Not a mark of foot, fire, or lodge could be found. It had been swept clean by the fiery winds of the desert, and even his keen eyes failed to find a sign. At the center of what was once camp, however, was his scout headband and the staff of the shaman. Hanging from the lance in a circle were 60 feathers. He knew that the time had come, as a long ago Vision Quest had declared, for him to wander alone, far away from his people. As Stalking Wolf pulled the lance from the ground, a coyote sounded from afar. He lifted his eyes, and there on the ridge in the misty distance stood Coyote Thunder. His great-grandfather waved a solemn goodbye, and Grandfather knew that this would probably be the last time he would see him. Coyote was very old, over 100 winters, and his health was failing. Suddenly, there was the call of another coyote. The mists of the distant ridge cleared, and where Coyote had stood there was a young boy dressed in the clothes of a white man, collecting ancient stones, talking stones that spoke of ancient times. The boy stood and waved to Grandfather, as had Coyote. Then he was gone. Grandfather struggled to find the message of what he had seen. First there had been Coyote, and then a boy, a white boy. At that, playing with stones, it didn't make sense. But the land remained mute and unyielding, and a great loneliness filled him. For over 20 years, his small tribe had been his family. Now, because of his vision, he was forced into exile. This vision seemed to have no end, except perhaps in wandering itself. Was there more? He knew that he would spend the rest of his life looking for the answer to that question. But for now he just sat at the old camp, searching his thoughts for a place to start his journey, his quest. He lost himself for a while in the work of setting up camp. For here he decided to stay until a path revealed itself. That night he dreamed of a white mountain lion calling him back to the place of the original quest. Before the morning sun broke the horizon, Grandfather had broken camp and was headed back to the place of the original vision. He hadn't been back to that place since that vision, and now he yearned to drink of its purity and isolation once again. There he hoped he would find the answers, or at least a direction. He traveled quickly, as a scout, avoiding all potential dangers, real or imagined. His mind was fixed on that sacred place where it all began for him, for his father, and for so many of his people. The trek lasted several days, across desert, over mountain, and through forest. The terrain was tough, but his training easily carried him. Like the eagles soaring the skies, his trip was an effortless flight. It was sunset as he approached the final ridge that looked over the sacred area. As he neared the top, the memories of his first trip flooded forth. His spirit soared, his body trembled with anticipation until his longing eyes broke the horizon of the ridge and his stomach sickened at what lay below. There below him was sprawled a miner's town. Huge holes gaped in the earth, and the soil was torn by the deep swaths of a roadway. All about lay garbage, broken machinery, and muddy water where once the stream had flowed fast and clear. Buildings were tossed about the landscape in a careless, haphazard manner, and the smell of rotten sweat and liquor filled the air. On the winds drifted the drunken laughter, arguing and turmoil of the inhabitants. People stumbled from building to building, throwing bottles to the ground, laughing, shoving, and shouting. This sacred place had been destroyed, butchered. Trees had been cut, rocks moved, and the solitude destroyed. To Grandfather's horror, nailed on the front of a building was the gorgeous hide of a white mountain lion. A coyote sounded near Grandfather, and the people began firing guns blindly at the ridge where Grandfather sat. In a flurry of bullets, Grandfather slipped from the ridge into the safety of the wilderness, his head spinning with disbelief, anger, and pain. He wandered aimlessly for many suns, trying to understand these white people who had no regard or reverence for the natural things. Moreover, he did not know why the mountain lion's spirit had called him back. Why? What reason could there possibly be in all that destruction and sacrilege? What reason could there be for him to be its witness? The more he thought about that sacred area, the more he knew that he had to go back and find the lesson in the destruction. Whatever the intent, he had to follow his dreams and visions, seeking their wisdom no matter how painful. It was an incomplete answer, but it was the only direction he had right then, and he knew that no more would be given until he followed the one at hand. What troubled him perhaps even more was that he should have known something was wrong miles before he got to that sacred area. Had the sacred scout skills failed him, or did the spirits blind him to the warning? He would return again to this diseased town, only this time as a scout. To get a closer look, he used the cover of the night to slip back to the town. He knew that where there were villages, there would be men scattered throughout the surrounding area. The nuances of the night foretold of people coming and going all around him, but he could sense their apprehension, their inability to blend with the landscape, especially at night. He was secure in his skill, and at home in the wilderness of darkness. His trip went easily. Not a bird or beast sang of his arrival. To all concerned, he was invisible. A few hours before sunrise, he arrived at the ridge overlooking the town. Below, everything was silent. Like a phantom, he slipped down into the street, passing the horses and dogs without a sound. Nothing stirred to his presence. The main street was thick with the smell of manure and the stench of unclean men. Garbage, rotted food, and broken bottles were strewn about, making travel slow and difficult. On the raised wooden sidewalks, men slept the blind sleep of drunkenness. Some lay clutching bottles, others were clutching guns as if in unconscious battles with the night and all its imagined terrors. Grandfather easily passed through town, searching every alley, peering into windows and gazing into the open holes of the miners. He searched for answers to the questions of his heart until the sky turned from black to the dark blue of approaching dawn, when he returned to the ridge to a small fissured cave to sleep, escaping the eyes of man. He awoke late in the afternoon, judging from the actions of the birds. The sky was dark and overcast, the distant hills misty with rain. He slipped back to the edge of town, hiding momentarily in a dilapidated tool shack. From his vantage point, he could see the comings and goings of the townspeople. Grandfather noticed how restricted their movements were, how square, box-like houses and heavy clothing cut them off from the elements. It seemed they saw nothing of the natural world, eagles soaring overhead unnoticed. They lived in a vacuum, separated from everything but themselves and the squalor they'd created. These people seemed so strange. They didn't blend with the wilderness but feared it, holding it at a safe distance like a man handling a deadly snake. They had no regard for the land, animals, plants, or even water. Litter was freely tossed. Live trees and brush were carelessly cut from around the dwellings. Unnameable waste was everywhere. These men were worse than their domesticated animals, living in their own filth, having no other purpose, it seemed, than to fatten and die. Laughter was usually drunken and at the expense of others. Otherwise, there was none. The faces of the village looked so pained and distorted with sadness that Grandfather wondered what directed these lives into this septic existence. So many questions filled his head. Why did they wear heavy clothes against the reality of nature? Why did they cloister themselves in sterile houses, rush about so aimlessly, or take such great time and care with simple processes of survival? Their lust for comfort, security, and safety seemed almost barbaric. It was foreign to Grandfather's thinking that anyone could consciously insulate themselves so lavishly from the wilderness and from life itself. Grandfather's attention was drawn to a young boy, a Native American but of uncertain origin. His hair was crudely chopped, and he dressed in old ripped clothing of a white man that was far too big for him. His walk was labored and clumsy in heavy boots, not at all the fluid and silent gait of his ancestors. He was stumbling around a wagon while unloading bundles onto a deck. One of the bundles burst and spilled onto the muddy street. A large white man who had been standing on the platform the whole time began screaming at the young man, finally kicking him in the chest and throwing him face down into the mud. Other people began laughing at the boy as the man beat him with a whip. As the boy collapsed in pain and humiliation, the group of men went inside the building. Grandfather stared on in horror, for they had treated that boy worse than they had treated their animals. Rain began falling hard, casting the village into the darkness of cloud and mist. The boy lay in the mud, as still as death. Grandfather could no longer contain the rage and anguish that flooded his heart. In a flash, he slipped from the shed, then under one of the buildings, finally to the deck beside the young man. He carried the young one back to the old tool shed and threw a blanket over him, nursing him back to consciousness. The young boy opened his eyes for a moment, trying to orient himself, then without a word fell back into sleep. Grandfather waited for night, lashed together a travois, and dragged the semi-conscious boy to the distant cave far away from town. He made a fire and a warm bed of debris. When he had made sure the boy was in a comfortable sleep, he slipped back out into the night to hunt food. The next morning, the boy awoke with a start, disoriented. His face and chest held old scars of past whippings and the fresh scars of yesterday's lashing. The boy was afraid that he would be hunted and killed, but Grandfather put his mind at ease. It took a while for the boy to relax enough to accept Grandfather's caring, but somewhere deep inside his forgotten heritage, the boy instinctively trusted Grandfather's medicine and power. He had been taken from his parents when he was very young by the man who had beaten him the day before. He had been treated like a slave, a beast of burden and a whipping post. He was forced to sleep with the animals and forage for rotten scraps of food. Escape would mean a certain death because the man would hunt him down and kill him as he had others before. The boy, having none of his ancestors' skills, also feared the prospect of survival in the wilderness. He had never been trained in the old ways, but deep inside he could feel the pull of the pure and natural world, an existence far from the insanity of what he was living. Grandfather learned much from this young boy. All the horrors of the white suppression, all of the restrictions of reservation life, the starvation, the disease, the drunkenness, and the child stealing. He learned that the old ones were not even allowed to practice their religion, nor could they hunt for food. Instead, they had to live imprisoned on lands that could not support them, where the winters were cold enough to kill the elders and children, and the summers were full of thirst-scorching heat and killing disease. White Indian agents grew fat and rich by hoarding the government food and clothing that was meant for the reservation. Desperate tribes were thrown together, warriors were tortured or killed, and quickly the old ways were being destroyed. The once proud tribes were disillusioned and broken. Hopelessness and helplessness had become the rule. The boy went on to describe the white man's religion and how no two whites would agree on what was right. They had forced their religion upon the people. And though this religion held many truths spoken, rarely did the whites live the truths they espoused. Their black robes might speak of peace and love, but their lives were struggles of greed, power, and war. This only confused the people more, and the elders who turned their backs on the teachings of the white were cast aside, beaten, starved, and even killed. The young ones were sent away to distant schools to learn the white man's ways, only to find on the return that they were unable to live in either world. Treaties signed in good faith were met with lies and deceit and, in the end, the prison of the reservation. The whites were strong in numbers as well as weapons, but proved enormously weak in their ability to live with the earth. And because they feared the earth, they called it the wilderness and the forbidden, something to be ruled and civilized. The young Native American begged Grandfather earnestly to train him in the old ways so he could live away from the hell of the white world. Without hesitation, Grandfather agreed. At that moment, a coyote howled from the distant ridge. Thunder rolled across the sky, and Grandfather knew why he had been led back to this place. He had seen the insanity of people living against nature, and he had seen the cruelty that this isolation brings. He had seen the children of the earth lose their skills and beliefs to the suppression by the whites. He knew that someday the white man would have to pay for their sins. Grandfather took care of the young boy for more than a moon. He nursed him back to health and taught him simple survival and stalking skills and introduced him to the ancient spiritual truths. During that time, they moved camp further back into the hills for safety as encounters with people from the village were becoming more frequent. Once the boy was strong enough to travel and had mastered the basics of escaping and detection, Grandfather decided to move north and to the mountains. Before leaving, however, Grandfather went to the village one last time, saying only that he had to free the lion. That night he entered the village once again, stalked through town, and climbed the building that held the white mountain lion captive. He cut the skin down, praying and making ritual offerings as he wrapped it carefully and lovingly into a buckskin bag. He slipped from the village, leaving this one sacred place to the cancerous insanity of the whites. He felt the urge to stay and fight for the sanctity of this place, but he knew that fighting would not produce anything but pain and hatred. So with a reluctant heart, he looked now to the high purity of the mountains. Grandfather spoke often of his years in the mountains, wandering up into the heart of Canada, then back again to the southern reaches of the Rockies. For a few years, the young Indian stayed with Grandfather, learning the old ways until his skills were sufficient to keep him alive anywhere. The young man eventually took a young Indian wife and retired into the upper reaches of the Canadian Rockies. Grandfather visited them whenever he was near their home. That is, until the young man was killed while bringing his baby to a mission for help. Some local farmers had mistaken him for a thief as they saw him running from the mission with a bundle in his arms. The bundle was his infant son, and both father and child died in the same senseless flurry of bullets. Grandfather never understood how anyone could feel that any possession was worth a human life. Thief or not, the young Indian should not have had to die. It was about the time of the young Indian's death that Grandfather left the sanctuary of the high, rugged Rocky Mountains and began living in the deserts. Like his life in the mountains, he pushed his skills to perfection, practiced the spiritual teachings, and vision quested. Whenever possible, he would seek out the elders of tribes in the area, learning whatever he could and sharing his knowledge. Some of these old ones became lifelong friends and guides, and he would visit them often in his travels. Many times he would sneak onto reservations and gather a group of children, teaching them the old ways of skill and spirit. Often, however, he was run off by the whites and sometimes the Indian people themselves. So brainwashed were they about the taboos of the ancient ways and what the repercussions of learning them could bring that they kept their children from them. But more places than not, he and his teachings were welcome. Again and again, another calling, another vision would lead him to other lands. His spiritual quest led him to the West Coast, up to Alaska, down the center corridor of the Great Plains, to the Mississippi Valley, up the East Coast again, then back down through Mexico and into Central America. In his wanderings, Grandfather crossed this country many times, and always he was learning, seeking the things of spirit, and pushing himself beyond his limitations of yesterday. He would settle in and learn an area only until the next vision pushed him on. But even where he did settle, there was little rest, for he was always a scout, living secretly and undetected, fearful always that he would be caught by the whites and sent to the reservation, or worse. With a few exceptions, he stayed away from the white people. As he grew older, he sought only the company of the wilderness and the spirits, rarely visiting even the elders. He wandered for the better part of his life. Everywhere he traveled, he witnessed the senseless destruction of the earth and his people. Like an unchecked cancer, the devastation quickly grew out of control. No place seemed safe, untouched, not even the rugged, hidden areas, the places in which as a young man he had always sought refuge. The more he witnessed, the more he became concerned that he would not fulfill his vision, a vision of becoming a great teacher. Willing students, young or old, were increasingly difficult to find in this fast-changing society. And many of those who seemed willing were at best only curious or not willing to put in the work and sacrifice needed to learn the old ways properly. Modern society had produced people who thrived on instant gratification, on lightning fast and easy learning. Their new values were foreign to the teachings of the earth. He was growing old and running out of time. His desperation, loneliness, and despair were intense. His vision had led him to a weariness beyond old age. There seemed to be no end in sight to the helter-skelter folly of modern life. It was at this pinnacle of despair and old age, when his vision was fading, that Grandfather decided to end his life. He felt as if the spirits had abandoned him. They had not followed his vision properly. that all was lost. So he wandered back to his homeland to find his people, and decided that if he found them vanished like so many others, he would end his existence. He wanted no longer to see the destruction of the earth. He would rather live out the remainder of his years with his people or not live at all. His long path brought him back to the ancient sacred area where he had had his first vision, the place of the ancient scout, the white mountain lion and the white coyote. As he crested the ridge, he expected to see the squalid village once again, but to his amazement, it was gone. It had vanished from the face of the earth in the flames of a fire, the drying winds, and the erosion of time. Hardly a scar was visible. Nature had reclaimed what was once hers, and his heart soared. He set up camp near the same rocky outcropping where he had his vision. Here he felt safe, and here he wanted to stay until he died. As the sun set, a lone coyote moved to a distant ridge and released its long, primal cry of loneliness, and thunder rolled across the sky. Grandfather stood trembling, knowing it was a calling from his great-grandfather. More coyotes, more thunder joined in until the night vibrated with their callings. Then all fell silent. The ancient warrior appeared as he had many years before, vivid and strong, standing out from the blazing horizon like he was cast in stone. He motioned to Stalking Wolf. Then, as before, he motioned to the east, only this time with more power in his command. Coyote's body turned to shadow, then evaporated, leaving only the pointing hand. Grandfather gazed toward the east. A small boy collecting ancient talking stones turned and looked at Grandfather, then smiled and became a white coyote that finally lost itself in the final flicker of sunset. Grandfather headed east. By plan or design, I was collecting fossils that day by the river when I saw Grandfather. I smiled, feeling that I had known him forever, and in the distance I heard a coyote howl. Grandfather smiled with tears running down his cheeks, but I was too young then to know why. That was all that Grandfather revealed about his life and vision for a while. We could clearly understand his driving force and how he had no choice but to live his vision or die. We were amazed at the 63 years he spent wandering and searching, sacrificing everything that most people would normally cherish. He had no real home except for the wilderness, and no possessions other than the truths of his heart. It would be many months before Grandfather revealed the many things that happened to him during those 63 years of wandering. But for this night, we had enough to understand, and we began to understand him.